Thank you for your attendance this Friday morning at our conference, Art of Critique. My name is Townsend. I'm an assistant professor in art history, and it's my deep pleasure to introduce this panel and paper titled Surrogate Humanity, Race, Robots, and Politics of Technological Futures, to be delivered to us and then in conversation with Neda Atanasosky and Kalindi Bora. And one of the excitements of this conference is getting to invite colleagues at UC schools whom we've admired from afar and feel our work might be in conversation with, and now get to genuinely in the flesh be in conversation together. So really quickly, bios are in the back, but it's always, I think, worthwhile to queue up a few details. Neda Atanasosky is an assistant professor of feminist studies and the director of critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She specializes in the areas of US and Eastern European media and cultural studies, focusing particularly on the politics of religion and sexuality, post-socialism, human rights and humanitarianism, and war and nationalism. She's the author of the book, Humanitarian Violence, the US Deployment of Diversity, 2003, and has edited and published multiple works, and is co-author with Kalindi Bora of the forthcoming book, Surrogate Humanity, Race, Techno-Liberalism, and the Engineering of Contested Futures, coming out in 2 weeks, I think, from Duke, March 2019. So this is the world premiere of their launch tour for the book, we're going to claim. And Kalindi Bora is Associate Professor for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and Director of the Feminist Research Institute at the University of California, Davis. Prior to that, she was at UC San Diego, where she served as Associate Professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies. Her research is situated in feminist science and technology studies, postcolonial and transnational South Asian and diaspora studies, critical race studies, and cultural studies of gendered labor and globalization. She's the author of Life Support, Biocapital, and the New History of Outsourced Labor in 2015, and co-author then of this exciting forthcoming book, Surrogate Humanity. So please welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for waiting while we got our tech set up. We just wanted to thank Natalia, Lori, and Lauren for all the work in bringing us here. We didn't come from far, but we know these events take a lot of logistical labor. Also, just a slight correction to our bios, we're actually both full professors. And our talk today is, we co-wrote and co-researched every word of the book, and we write our talks together as well, but just for convenience, I'll be reading the first half, and Neda will read the second half. So the talk is titled, the same thing as our updated book title, which is Surrogate Humanity, Race, Robotics, and the Politics of Future Technologies. So I'll just launch in. So the Mine Kafan, created by Afghan designer Masoud Hassani in Kabul, is a wind-powered metal ball with bamboo legs. Afghanistan is estimated to contain nearly 10 million active landmines. The Kafan prototype is devised to be heavy, so that as the wind moves it across war-ravaged lands, laden with mines that have not yet been activated, the sweeper can trip the mines with nearly its weight as it tumbles. The bamboo spikes are designed to blow off of this porcupine light bulb upon impact of the landmine while the center remains intact. Each Kafan can handle up to 4 blasts. It's also affordable. It costs about $40 to make all replace a unit. Hassani's goal is to clear the world of landmines within a decade with low-cost tools such as this wind-powered minesweeper. The Kafan, which moves without human intervention or control through wind power, is in a sense autonomous. Yet, although it moves autonomously, Hassani's design is not a robot, and we're thinking about it, as you will see, together with obvious robot technology. But this design is not a robot, nor even a high-cost or high-tech design. Moreover, unlike many other kinds of military technologies, the Kafan can be read as a caring technology, performing a feminized work of cleaning up the ravaged landscapes produced by war, rather than taking part in the act of killing. Because the minesweeper also cares for human life, it untethers caring from the purview of the human actor. As a technology, the CAFON thus unexpectedly brings technologies of care to the fields of war. And wind-powered as it is, it stands, we argue, as a critique to post-Enlightenment concepts of autonomy as derived as a conscious subject of free will. So this is a different kind of autonomy we see in this design. So we open our talk today with this example of a curating autonomous military technology to think about the particularities of how racial, gender, sexual, and other forms of difference inform the imaginaries guiding the design of functional technologies. Our book looks at projects like the Minecafon in comparison to the design imaginaries behind several US military-funded research projects intending to produce autonomous robots that would, at least in a speculative way, diminish the need for human soldiers to risk their lives. These projects, again, we argue, demonstrate the racialized and gendered terms of service that are subsumed into techno-liberal fantasies of human autonomy and command. For example, Boston Dynamics, one firm that has received US government funding for developing military robotics, gained notoriety in October 2013 when it released a video of a 6-foot-tall, 320-pound humanoid named Atlas running freely in the woods. Has anyone seen this? Do you remember Atlas? Okay, I'm going to play the video for you to see. To give you a sense of how it's both designed but also how it's marketed. So Atlas is a prototype that was first introduced to the media as standing in for soldiers in battle. So that was supposedly the point of this design. But later was kind of remarketed as a rescue robot intended to replace firefighters, police officers, or agents cleaning up nuclear waste, so high-risk environments. In response to the idea that Atlas was designed as a first responder for various crises, like nuclear disasters, numerous media reports about the robot insisted that it was much easier to imagine this huge machine as a super soldier than as a humanitarian actor. One reporter proclaimed, quote, "At 6'2" and 330 pounds, the US Army's new Atlas robot just might give Arnold Schwarzenegger a run for his money. Atlas can turn a knob, manipulate tools, and yes, fire machine guns," end quote. Implicit in this video is the fact that despite its PR, Atlas has also been designed for Amazon warehouse work, which we won't talk about today, but is an important vector here. Though it's outside the scope of this talk, one perceived threat that designers work against when they're premiering these humanoid robots, and there's a kind of curatorial intention in that statement. So premiering these kind of videos is the obsolescence of the human, which we also discuss in the book, but not today. So the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, funds Atlas, like other Boston Dynamics robot projects. Yet, in spite of the fact that killer robots appear to be an unprecedented innovation, as one magazine reported, Atlas is not unprecedented, but is an outgrowth of already existing trends in the military. So this brings us to think about the funding that structures engineering research labs around the world, and the imaginaries that direct that funding, techno-utopic imaginaries. These imaginaries, therefore, also impact the distribution of resources in the present And we argue this distribution happens along vectors of race, gender, class, and other social hierarchies. At the same time, following philosopher Denise de Silva's formulation, we must insist on what she calls knowing at the limits of representational categories of difference. So in other words, if the dominant imagination of systemic social change in mainstream US and European public discourse focuses on a techno-utopic world, so a world in which all of those who are already human and already subjects ascend into the realm of a sort of human-free or unmanned technological infrastructure. So this might be in factories, in the military, or we talk about care robotics and nursing homes. So if that's this kind of mainstream techno-utopic imaginary, then how do we think about the relationship of new technologies to possible fields of political protest or action? So that's kind of the way that we're thinking about this juxtaposition of design imaginaries. So in our book, we use the concept of the surrogate human effect to explain how difference, so all those categories of difference that were mentioned, continues to structure what kind of subjects or which subjects become legible as human, even as it structures design imaginaries insofar as these are organized through logics of recognition within social and cultural structures that are predicated by categories of racial difference. So this concept that Denise de Silva offers, the concept of knowing at the limits here of justice, is a practice that unsettles what has become, but offers no guidance for what has yet to become. So in the first panel, there was a discussion of utopia and heterotopia, and so we offer knowing at the limits to kind of extend that discussion. So unsettles what has become, but offers no guidance for what will yet become. We also think about Sylvia Wynter's, philosopher Sylvia Wynter's call for imagining the human after man as an ontological problem. And we connect this to Alexandre Wahellier's argument that posthumanism, a rapidly growing field to think about what's after the human, this field has failed to address the role of race in the way that the parameters of the human are laid down to begin with. This points to the coexistence of the world of the human as subject, what Winters calls man, with those other worlds that have been forcibly written upon it by colonial practices that continue outside and alongside it. So we think about how these worlds, according to subaltern historian Dipesh Chakravarti, circulate together with, but are not commensurate with, the post-Enlightenment subject in its history, now incorporated into the history of capitalism. So for the purposes of today's conference, we think about how this impasse has been part of the project of decolonial and postcolonial politics, and has been taken up in affiliated scholarship, most notably in South Asian and Latin American subaltern studies. So the dissident technological imaginaries that we think about in our book, which so far you've seen the Mein Kampf on, and our book comes out in 2 weeks, as was mentioned. So if you want to hear more, please look. So these dissident technological imaginaries take up categories that challenge those of what we call techno-liberal capitalism, right? This techno-utopics of the future. And we read these dominant design imaginaries against dissonant imaginaries, which are often found in the work of designers, engineers, and roboticists framing their project as art rather than as technological development. So together with our critique of these dominant design imaginaries, part of what we call techno-liberalism, we think with these dissident designers to explore the possibilities of technology to break from historically sedimented dynamics of freedom and unfreedom woven into the fabric of technological modernity. So in addition to offering critique, each chapter thinks through how design imaginaries can push at the limits of what is possible, disrupting confining notions of possibility that are housed in the engineering imaginaries we critique. Okay, so one more video for you.
These are your things.
That's not how the sound is supposed to go. Say it again?
You can lower it right on the screen where the
Oh no, it's the audio.
This is your car. This is your toothbrush. These are your things. But these are the things that matter. And somewhere in between is this guy. Introducing Geballe, the world's first family robot. Say hi, Geballe.
Hi, Geballe.
Geballe helps everyone out throughout their day. He's the world's best cameraman. By intelligently tracking the action around him, you can independently take video and photos, so that you can put down your camera and be a part of the scene.
Gina, take the picture.
He's a hands-free helper. You can talk to him, and he'll talk to you back, so you don't have to skip a beat.
Excuse me, Anne?
Yes, Geballe.
Melissa just sent a reminder that she's picking you up in half an hour to go grocery shopping.
Thanks, Geballe.
He's an entertainer and educator. Through interactive applications, Geballe can teach.
Let me in, or else I'll blow your house in.
Hey, where'd you go? There you are.
It's the closest thing to a real-life telephone.
Okay, so once again, a promotional video. So before I talk about the actual technology, I just want to point your attention to a few things. First, the interfaces through which Geballe interacts affectively with humans. So its green ball display references the emotive expression of the human eye. It performs attention by using a 3-axis motorized system to point its screen in the direction of a speaker and to perform small dips and bobs, which you observed, that indicate a deferential focus on the speaker. Its speech engagement performs an obedient interest in the commands, needs, and affective states of that speaker. There is not hardware or software for receiving the same from the interactant. So, if I had shown you the rest of the promotional video, you would have seen many things, including this still. It moves through the video, it moves through a set of familiar, heterosexual, middle-class, nuclear family scenes. You saw a Geballe taking photos on command at a child's birthday party, Geballe reading a bedtime story, Geballe politely taking requests to send messages to the daughter of a woman needing bread dough in the kitchen. And finally, the one we didn't show you, Geballe helping a single white man set up a date with a white woman and order takeout for 2. The final scene. Geballe's body moves continuously throughout each scene, denoting its attention and interactivity. When the frame gives us an occasional perspectival shot from Geballe's vantage, we see the same family scenes with people's faces framed and named by facial recognition software, which, when this video came out, we did not have on our phones and computers, but now we do. After reviewing Geballe's genealogy through a montage of popular cultural images of friendly interactive robots, including Rosie, the robot from the animated Jetsons TV program, which, for those of you who don't know, was created in the US in the 1960s and later syndicated in the 80s worldwide, we're told that Geballe is, quote, not just a metal shelf, nor is he just a 3-axis motor system. He's not even just a connected device, he's one of the family, end quote.
So this fast commercialization of domestic service robots, the first of their kind, inserts them into the home in a way that normalizes and reproduces the white US middle-class nuclear family form, as you saw, the modes of affect through which it is perpetuated, and the types of labor-based interactions that maintain the household as an economic and hierarchical unit. How is Geballe's embodiment enacting a sociality, then, that's more complex than would a smartphone with a rotating head? What import does the affect and embodiment of an obedient physicality and machine subjectivity have, given the goal of making a domestic service robot as commonplace as a car or a toothbrush? These questions require an examination of the gendered, sexual, racial architecture of the service relation as a surrogate human effect that is engineered into social robotics. For many of us, particularly in the North American context, a dehumanized, obedient figure in this white, property-owning, heteropatriarchal family household is not unfamiliar. Geballe inherits a long history of those enslaved and immigrant workers and women of color who have historically performed that support labor. Labor that creates and makes that household economy possible and allows it to seem like a self-contained and self-sufficient unit. To understand an even deeper level of racial architecture behind the gendered and race position that Geballe inhabits, we can look at the engineering imaginary behind Geballe's emotional interactivity, and obeyant attention. This imaginary extends back into a colonial scientific imaginary of how the performance of emotion reveals the place of a given race on the imagined spectrum of evolution. We can begin by looking at the history of how social roboticists turned to Charles Darwin's theories to program emotion and sociality. The prototype for interactive social robots like Geballe is Cynthia Breazeal's robot, Kismet, that you see here. Built in the late 1990s, it was designed on a model of infant caregiver interaction and programmed with drives imagined to be the basic neurological underpinning of human affect. Processors, input devices, and hardware are required to animate Kismet's face. Kismet's program drives, modeled on Darwin's imagination of human biological drives, determine the robot's performance of an emotional state. Breazeal says, quote, "The signaling of emotion communicates the creature's evaluative reaction to a stimulus event or act, and thus narrows the possible range of behavioral intentions that are likely to be inferred by observers," end quote. Breazeal's understanding of emotion derives from Darwin's 1872 proposal that, quote, "emotive signaling functions were selected for during the course of evolution because of their communicative efficacy," end quote. Darwin's writing on emotion and evolution precisely captures the movement when modern scientific knowledge establishes the post-Enlightenment liberal modern European subject as self-identical with the category of the human. For Darwin, those who are, quote, "deprived of reason," like animals, the insane, and those races distant from Europeans, become brute in character as they are reduced to base emotion. Yet, as he explains, these primordial habits are the basis of our evolution as a species. These are imagined as habits that Europeans have overcome through civilization to represent the apex of humanity. So then we can read Breazeal's approach to emotionally expressive robots as a kind of Darwinism with a twist. Here, the robot is designed as a mirror to prove to us that the apex of human evolution is our ability to perform the existence of an interior psyche to the social world. Kismet and Geballe can only mirror human states. The position of the robot is always inferior because it must perform affect transparently, and therefore cannot perform proof of the hidden interior psyche that would indicate equality to the human. In this model of social robotics, human uniqueness is preserved, and machine sociality is positioned to enrich human social life. The post-human imaginary in social robotics could expand and potentially redescribe the human and its social worlds, but instead replicates a singular social scientific racial imaginary of what the human is and what it can aspire to be because of its basic Darwinian logic. Breazeal is the leading social roboticist in the United States and understands the physicality of the robot, that is, both its morphology and its material presence in space, as crucial to constructing a social relation between humans and machines. Breazeal writes that, quote, "facial expression, body posture, gesture, gaze direction, and voice all work together as part of the morphology of humanoid robots, making them suited to communicate with humans. They must sense the human, perceiving social cues and responding to human emotional states." So to go back to Geballe, for the robot to emerge as a social partner to the normative human that is intuitive and enjoyable for the human to interact with, it has to demonstrate that it's learning and responding appropriately through emotive expressions that are legible as properly those of fear, anger, happiness, surprise, and so on to the human user. Its intentions must be transparent, and its affective performance must reassure the human interactor that they are the dominant. For this to happen, the robot had to be endowed with what Breazeal calls socio-cognitive architecture that makes it legible in the episteme of colonial modernity. The socio-cognitive architecture is based upon the colonial imaginary of the great chain of being, where Darwin's lesser races were understood to run on the same basic set of drives as those programmed into the robots Kismet and Geballe. so that the very nature of the way they are engineered to interact with humans has colonial racial inferiority hardwired into their interactive hardware and software. In other words, mainstream social robots are designed to maintain a form of relating that preserves a dominating, autonomous, liberal, post-Enlightenment subject as the only form of recognizable humanity. To help communicate this problem of the racial unconscious programmed to social robots like Geballe, we'll now discuss a dissident robotics project called OMO that you see here. OMO is a relational robot designed by roboticist Kelly Dobson as part of a project titled Machine Therapy. Dobson argues that robots like Geballe that are imagined to replace human positions are modeled to represent a whole creature or person, and so seem like a human replacement. Companion robots are generally designed to be soothing and normatizing. They're intended to help a person meet a narrow range of socially accepted achievements, like Geballe's performance of support labor in the white middle-class heteropatriarchal family household. Dobson criticizes companion robot design in that these robots are not meant to present their own anxieties and neuroses, but simply to comfort, serve, and survey. She designed and built the robot OMO to, quote, be experienced by a person as in between being part of the person, something akin to a prosthetic or body part, and as a separate being, as opposed to troping whole anthropomorphic others, say a nurse, a pet, or a grandchild visiting a care facility, end quote. So you'll be able to see a little bit how OMO behaves here. OMO is constructed as a football-shaped orb with a springy surface meant to feel like skin. It expands and contracts regularly and at a variable rate. The volume and rate of this expansion and contraction is programmed to vary in response to the stimulus of pressure from another object touching it, whether that object is breathing or vibrating. OMO can follow a breathing pattern or lead a pattern. Dobson describes OMO as a transitional object, saying, quote, the machine may sometimes effortlessly and smoothly seem like a part of the person holding it, and at other times the person may perceive the very same machine as a separate object, as its own being. OMO may seem in some situations at some times to behave like an organism, a creature, or sympathetic friend, pet, or partner, but it is designed intentionally to not be stably such. It is not designed to be a servant-employee machine, but rather has errors and noise built into its programming that lead it to act erratically and to possibly break down, end quote. Dobson's critique is important because human functional equivalents, like companion robots, both reflect and shape fantasies of human otherness. And as people interact and reflect from these caring machines and soothing machines, people are in effect being trained into new understandings of caring and soothing. And then this can change our definitions of care, much as our definition of what work is changed with industrialization. Geballe, and also OMO, as a critique of projects like Geballe, point to the affective aspect of the surrogate human relation that scaffolds technoliberalism. Technologies of artificial intelligence and robotics, like those required for the automation of labor, project the colonial scientific ordering of things into the future temporality of what it is to feel human. Technology has become the premier boundary set for both projecting future possibilities and of maintaining the liberal human as a process of indefinite becoming. Technology is also the site for a continuation of the colonial scientific delimitation of the future of human becoming by establishing the order of things as a techno-scientific order of things. For example, we can think about algorithms or data science as two infrastructures that do this. In other words, as we've argued, the surrogate can now be described as an effect of the relationship with technologies that delimit and order in temporality in which the colonial and racial logics undergirding something that we might call human nature are projected into the indefinite future. So we will end here.
Thank you for this slightly bracing paper. And I'll keep my comments relatively brief because the conversation, I think, will be sparked. You heard our reactions, our shocked reactions. Even to the examples you gave it, they also have a bit of braciness. So thank you so much for giving us a reading or an insistence on reading the race and gendered social relations found between bodies, machine and human, that might otherwise go unmarked as racialized relations in these robotics practices in particular, which as you led us through, endeavor to naturalize or sort of make non-social, those kinds of relations. And in particular here, this contemporary desire for technology to perform what you are calling a surrogate effect. So from surrogacy, as it's been theorized as this racialized and gendered arrangement, producing autonomy and universality for the master, which you are now saying can be described as an effect. So we sort of move into this contemporary moment of effects, something you are prompting us to recognize or diagnose, if I'm understanding it correctly, within racial liberalism and practices of reducing the humanity of racialized others to prop up our recognition of others. That's what you laid out for us. And what I'm really interested in this shorter version from that book that you presented, you bookend that crucial analysis with these two examples of projects identified as art. And of course, we're here to discuss the art of critique, and introduce them as potentially, or maybe even already, dissident design imaginaries. So we have both, we have kind of art and we have design imaginaries. And I hope that we can talk a little bit about how design is defined and operating for you. It seems to be approaches to prototyping maybe, or not even just programming, but programming into interactive prototypes. And these projects are meant to explore the possibilities of technology breaking somehow from the dynamics of freedom and unfreedom that you're insisting upon and we are brought in to recognize. So the first one is this project by the Afghan designer Masoud Hassani in Kabul, and it was so lovely to be invited to think about heft and weight and how bamboo must also be heavy in this particular piece. And yet, at the same time, I was really struck by how we don't have a marketing image for this, right? So it was our still image, and everything else, of course, is anthropomorphized to make us desire it. Do we not have an advertisement for this piece because, in fact, it can only work where it can't be seen? Of course, you really point to how this piece ultimately sort of untethers, you said at one point, the dynamics of caring from a status of a human actor. But it's also just really striking that in order to use this piece, one sort of can't see it operating. So there's this, it's not just that it doesn't have a face or no face goes on it, but the sort of a landscape that can't be grasped, that's going to be exploding, that's going to have this item moving around in it in ways we can't describe through metaphors of sight. Seems interesting, and I wondered if you were tracking this dynamic of vision. And that's also because this phrase design imaginary, and particularly the status of an image within that imaginary, if that's a dynamic inference. I'm very lucky to know that you have a book coming out, so I can just say, is it in the book? How are you sustaining it or exploring it there? second art project / dissident robotics project, OMO, by this roboticist Kelly Dobson, which I had not heard of before, and so thank you for introducing me to it. And we understand it emerges from Dobson's criticism of this compulsion to design robots around an idea of a companion and then the service function that you highlighted. And you quoted, maybe not in the version you gave, but in the paper you provided, that the sort of standard category of thought is engaged in troping whole anthropomorphic others, like a nurse, a pet, or a grandchild visiting a care facility. And I was really interested in this suggestion that the almost departing from those kinds of behaviors, and it resonated a little bit with the image that we opened with in the first session, where this action of recoiling in ambivalence, so a kind of refusal of that insistence on this service solidarity of a user and a support person. Can we get out of that simply by an action of recoiling? How does recoiling map onto an idea of ambivalence? So we have here the kind of physical, and then what can be seen or experienced. And then the other thing that, because of that bookending, we have then two designers that are named, Hassani and Dobson, and they are mobilized, at least in this version, to be counteracting entities that aren't precisely named, that are collectives of an organized kind, like the US military or Hewlett-Packard. And it was interesting then to think about these scales of authorship, particularly because that question of whether, and in this case it's sort of our heroes or our designers that might get us out of it who bear a name, whereas typically we're thinking about trying to escape singular authorship. And this conference has had a variety of co-authored, collaborative, co-presented papers. So there's already, presumably, I'm sure you ask about it all the time, there's your dynamic of not being singular authors. So maybe the reflection on collaboration and scales of production as they then fit into what can be seen and imagined. And then lastly, I would love just a little bit more on the figure of the designer. So if we were worrying about the figure of the curator in the last session, now we have this figure of the designer. Can we have design without designers? What is this design imaginary? Is techno-liberalism sustained by design imaginary? Can they be broken up? You know, can we have a heroic design practice that doesn't have designers? How are you thinking about that?
I just want to tell stories. So interesting things happen when we present this work to different audiences. So for example, we presented it to a German media studies culture design lab a year and a half ago. And someone in the lab was kind of bothered and said, am I supposed to feel guilty for sitting on a chair? And we took it really seriously and thought quite a lot about it. So like, who designs a chair? Who designed the chair? Who's responsible? And does it have a history of racial servitude built into it? I think the question was meant to express a certain kind of privileged exasperation with the politics of difference, et cetera, but we decided that rather than roll our eyes and move on, we would actually take the question very seriously, and I think it articulates really well with this question of authorship. What does it matter that there was a political intention behind the designs that are dissident, whereas you're saying the designs funded by DARPA, right, like by Boston Dynamics, for example, they don't have a clear author, right? They're functional in some way, they're serving some purpose, or at least that's how they're presented, but they have whole media campaigns around it, right? Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question, and where it goes for me is, how do we talk about design, which is everywhere, right? It's kind of people talk about it now as this very inclusive, and and maybe Nita wants to talk about, we talk about 3D printers and that kind of populist imaginary. Now everyone's a maker, right? What's a maker versus a designer? But it's harder, it's more difficult to talk about infrastructure when you can't point to a designer, because then you can't point to an intention. I didn't answer your question at all.
No.
I mean, in some ways, I think we don't, you asked about the book as a whole, and I don't think that this question of design that comes up more in this talk, it's sort of this question of authorship and who the designer is, isn't so much at the center as engineering imaginaries are. And so in some ways, we think of that as important because it does speak to this question of what goes unmarked in these imaginaries and what we want to point to as kind of the way in which, so we have all of these engineering imaginaries that are sort of describing this unprecedented future. The way this project started is we were moving from our project on post-socialism, where we were thinking about sort of what do revolutionary imaginaries look like within this post-socialist global condition that we're living in. And we picked up on how much public discourse about revolution was tied to technology. So technology is a site where revolution, like we're in this revolutionary new future, and both of us living in the Bay Area, it's a very pressing political question. And so what are these sort of unprecedented technological imaginaries, or ostensibly unprecedented? And we really wanted to track sort of how these historical forms of kind of like racialized imaginaries of labor and servitude delimit these, quote unquote, revolutionary new technologies. And then in relation to that, we were thinking like, okay, well, what are technologies that sort of aren't just there to sort of accelerate capitalist production, right? Even, and that's how we came to these kind of like, well, what is a sort of like non-productive technology? And that's where Kelly Dobson's work is so interesting to us. She's like, oh, technologies that are like meant, like designed to have failure,
Right.
error built into them. I think we named Kelly because she was one of the first people we interviewed for the book.
I see. Yeah.
But
I think we do that in other chapters too. I think there would be recognizable art and art production in every chapter. So it's not, I mean, we have very legibly visual art projects in different chapters, like the drone selfies. But
yeah. But I think we also don't want to kind of have this like art good engineering
right?
Thing going on either.
Right, which is why, which is very clear and effective in the text, and that is why it highlighted for me. Still, nevertheless, for the purposes of a short narrative, we have an entry with a maker thinking through how that maker can produce something that is not serving to define the human, and that stripping of care from a human actor seems so crucial, because you reminded us that the stakes of Dobson's piece is also, if we think about we're being trained how to care, or a kind of relationship to this device is forming our attitude.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to articulate how the post-socialist condition does sort of feed into this, just a little more explicitly, since again we have this kind of socialist imaginary for the first panel, it seems to fit well.
Okay, well, I actually was really excited to engage both of you more anyway, so this is a great opportunity. So Nita and I, around the same time as we started this project, which was here at Berkeley, which we talked about earlier, 2007, we also started a parallel project, which was to rethink, starting from Bandung, is where we were thinking at the time, all of these internationalist socialisms that were happening around the Communist International, but we're not identical with. And why so many of the market, well, we could say economic circulations that were happening in the early 2000s were going through former Soviet nations, through the south of Europe, into the places I was studying, which was South Asia, and then back around again. And so what was it about that time that could tell us something about the political economics of now? And at the same time, we were both, looking at the ways that Marxist socialism had been refused and wanted to do research into what were the other socialist imaginaries, or the proliferation of socialist imaginaries that were actually circulating between, the wars and thereafter. And as a result of that, we sort of cultivated several research groups over the years and came up with a kind of curated collection of work on, I would say, political imaginaries now, existing in different parts of the world. And we didn't try to do a representative collection, but, and I'm sure Nita will talk about some of the examples, but what we realized is that post-socialism as a multiplicity works in a way that thinking about post-socialism doesn't. So at the same time, we are all after the end of socialism, right? And that conditions how we think about political possibility. When you talked about sort of what kind of promises there are left of the left, one of the things we kind of took on in this special issue we did was the left, in a way, is kind of a specter that we kind of are thinking around. So this project came about to ask what kind of political imaginaries exist that aren't putting themselves forward as necessarily out of a socialist past, and then we can put those in contradistinction to the taking over of words like sharing, collaboration, and the commons by the very tech industry and techno-liberalism at the same time. So, like non-aligned cinema, I would love to think about how that does and does not articulate with the multiplicity of socialist imaginaries, and if it allows for us to think about these politics that aren't necessarily part of any kind of self-conscious, what was the word, inheritance of, the movements.
Yeah, and I'll just add very briefly that the first article we did that came out a couple years ago that started like the rest of the project, that we wrote shortly after our post-socialism residential research group was actually looking at how these imaginaries about how technology will bring about the end of capitalism. Like we started by thinking about Jeremy Rifkin, right? Like the zero marginal cost society and like 3D printers will bring about the end of capitalism. Like if careful examination of that kind of sort of techno-utopic imaginary, like the kind of, it's not just a kind of like left nostalgia where we have like this taking up of like socialist imaginaries. It's also in these imaginaries that are actually very much about the acceleration of capitalism, but that claim to be about other things like collaborative commons, sharing, zero marginal cost, etc. And from there, we went to these to sort of theorize what we're calling techno-liberalism, and these same imaginaries ostensibly like opposing themselves to kind of like Trump-style fascism, right? Like, it's not the immigrants taking the jobs; it's the robots. But then like, yeah. Anyway.
In Chicago, I saw a billboard that said that robots can't take your job if you're retired.
Yes. We talked about that at a recent conference paper. Prudential, yeah. Robot can't take your job if you retire early. Prudential. The other one that I love is like, they say millennials are lazy. Prove them right and retire early. It's like, yeah.
And I mean, along that sort of commercialization, just one more semi-connected comment. The face of Geballe, which isn't precisely a face, which you described in fact as its movements, which is such a compelling analysis. It's interesting to see that because it's been overtaken by Alexa, this just static device. So, which is not to suggest that the dynamics of servitude are somehow erased, but instead it's doubled down and then further naturalized. So just, yeah, each turn of the coin. So shall we let the audience, how much time do we have? We have like 25 minutes. Oh, great. Okay, lovely.
First, so thank you for a sort of fascinating paper. I sort of wanted to kind of follow up on a couple of things you said. First, I was wondering, and this must be in the book somewhere, about dealing with the placement of humans in warfare and how you sort of develop perhaps an argument in terms of the security state, the war on terror, and the sort of engineers and designers trying to put happy faces, show these robots in domestic sphere, and but isn't that where the industry is mostly going? And if you can sort of flesh that out, and then as a footnote to that. I've been writing on Martha Rossler and Hito Steyerl's work, and they both deal with robotics. And in the case of Hito Steyerl's work, it's a fairly darker and more complex vision of these promotional videos in the German context, and promoting promotions of these robots as doing dance steps for music videos and things like that. So I don't know if you know of either of these two artists and their work dealing with robotics and warfare, but if you don't, you might want to take a look. And if you can sort of maybe respond to the question about, sort of the war on terror, the surveillance state, and, and how that intersects with robotics.
Well, I guess I'll start by saying we do have 2 chapters that address this. And we end the book there because actually when it comes to what people are calling killer robots or lethal autonomous weapons, that's where the techno-utopic imaginary ends. And so there's these numerous NGOs and human rights organizations coming together to ban killer robots in the future tense, and of course all the funding for this. I mean, it starts before like the war on terror, so we have like the first use of drones like in the 90s, right? But we actually go somewhere a bit different there. We actually really try to think about what is it about killer robots that puts a limit to these techno-utopic imaginaries, and how do these human rights, this kind of call to ban killer robots in the future tense, how does that also maintain a particular version of the liberal autonomous human? So we sort of think about, for example, the way in which humanitarianism itself becomes a justification for fighting wars, right? And then what kinds of violence are authorized and what kinds aren't. Like, so we end with like this Philip K. Dick speculative fiction short story about killer robots that end up lying to humans and saving humans from sort of their own impulse to fight war, but and just also to think about like the example that we started with, the microphone, right? Like, what does it mean to think about a military technology as potentially like a carrying technology? We don't really talk about surveillance as much in the book.
Well, we do. I mean, there's the drone selfies project.
Right, the drone selfies.
What does it mean to have a surveillance technology, the artist asked, that turns, in a time imagined after war is no longer something we do. What do the drones do? And so they become vain and they look at themselves because, a drone is a visual technology. So they kind of play with this idea of what does the surveillance vision do? And it has nothing to surveil. But I don't know if this is kind of where you're thinking with the 2 artists you mentioned, but we do talk in our chapter about the parallel histories of automation and fascism. We look at, for example, this film called Ballet Robotique, where they're showing the robot arms of industrial assembly factory doing this kind of aesthetics of dance. And I think it's, maybe more akin to the kind of work you're talking about where there's an inherent message that's humanizing of machines. But the other thing that came up in your comments for me was one of the things we write about in looking at these, specifically killer robots and lethal drones, is this question of what it is that when people want to ban the possibility of a future with killer robots, the investment there is in a kind of lack of empathy. This machine can't have empathy, therefore it can't be an ethical killer. And so that's what we're really interested in, is how there's this projection onto the machine that actually, in fact, tells us that we're human and tells us what the human is and what the human can be in the future. So the idea is empathy is somehow the line between. The empathy is the thing that a killer robot can never have, therefore we can't have killer robots exist. So we spent a lot of time thinking about the kind of kernel of empathy and what it means to, what does it mean when to feel human is only through this kind of structure of self-reflection through empathy, I guess you could say. And we use Sadie Hartman work to think about.
And just to add, you had raised a comment about like the surrogate versus the surrogate effect. When we were initially thinking about the book, we were thinking about, okay, what does it mean when like technology, like the idea is technologies replace human actors, but they don't, right? That's what the surrogate effect is, right? It's that relation rather than the technologies themselves standing in for humans.
So maybe we'll go spatial.
So I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about the relationship between technology and revolution in particular, in relationship to the question of socialism and post-socialism. So if you think about some of the key figures of the historical avant-garde, we're talking about Razo Molinage or Carlos Chavez in Mexico or Berkeley, etc. So the relationship of techno-futurism to the question of the new man or a new humanism is very much an intimate one, right? And this is certainly something that we hinted at, but we didn't examine in detail. So I'm wondering what comes after the historical avant-garde desire to produce a new human or a new humanism. And we see that played out again in the 1950s and 1960s and in the second or neo-avant-garde moment, in relationship to political modernism here. So I think Fanon is a new humanism to a certain extent. Can we get out from this new human, this figure of the new human? And have you meditated on this possibility? And certainly from the example that we've shown today, that figure seems to be absent, but nonetheless haunting in its own way.
Were we going to go around? Or?
Yeah, maybe we should select a couple.
I have a different one with the revolution. Twitter was considered to be an organizing instrument for revolutionary rights, and it is the same instrument that's used for surveillance. So how indeed do you have a commons when that same instrument can be used to dehumanize and humanize? That's just a simple question.
Maybe I'll do one more just so that we try to be efficient.
Oh, okay. This question. So you said that you were just focusing on surrogate humanity robots that can't exactly replace humans, or are you saying that no robots can replace or do away with a human function? Because like there are some examples, like the video you showed of Atlas, the therapy from the killer robot that was trained to initially be an army or a soldier, but then first aid. But that guy seemed to have trouble walking in the snow. I don't know how to do that. I feel like the dogs could do better. But in other instances, there are supposedly, I have the Aryan effect, or going to be like Amazon drone deliveries that you can get it like within 24 hours without even like a person or UPS or whoever, just like the drone drops off in a little box and package. And I've also seen videos of grocery stores that are like cashierless, like everything is measured, you just take it and I don't know if you've got like an Apple Watch or what it is, and they just like automatically, like there's no pay, and it's just like automatically deducted. Those are just some thoughts I wanted to throw out there. There's a lot, it's hard to like do,
Yeah,
you know?
we can all enumerate them probably. But you want to try the revolution question? No.
Sure, we can collect a couple more. There's two of us.
Okay.
I had a question about the temporality, I guess, picking up from the first panel, especially because your mention of care made me think of Stephen Jackson's work on rethinking repair. And part of his argument there is, a lot of the work on technology is oriented towards the future, right? Kind of creating a new future. And we don't think about the work that is involved in maintaining systems that are already existing, right? So he kind of shifts the kind of perspective to thinking about everything we've inherited from the past, or that's still with us, that's still kind of laboring on, the kind of labor and work that's involved in just maintaining systems. And he has this idea of this kind of broken world, right? Like we live in a broken world. And if we think about repair, we think of that as opposed to being oriented towards the future. So I was just wondering if that was part of the way you were bringing in care in your book, and if part of the dissident imaginary is precisely the refusal of the future in that way.
Maybe one more?
I'm really interested in the kind of ways in which the form of the surrogate humanity seems to be changing as you're tracking it. And I'm glad that Annika brought up the idea of laxity. It seems like as there's this anxiety on this asymptotic point of recognizable humanness, on the one hand we have the Boston Technologies robot, which looks humanoid, right? It has a kind of barrel chest, it has hands. And then you have the Oma, which breathes and is supposed to have a kind of prosthetic sensibility. You then have the ways in which now Nests and Alexas don't take on anthropomorphic form. And I'm just wondering how the form of this surrogate humanity is shifting as our own anxieties about our porousness and its and their presence in our lives increases, right? Is there a way in which they have to become less recognizably like the form of the human as they take on more of the activities and the kind of affective work of the human?
Yes, of course, they are our director. No, please. No, but then we'll run out of time.
I was wondering if while you were doing research for this book, you came across or you thought about a kind of asymmetry of technology around the world, which is obvious, right? And it's kind of implicit in your talk because everything you're talking about is like the production of technology from the US. And the construction of race and futurity as inscribed into this technology as a kind of universal that is from here. But what happens elsewhere, right? What happens in relationship both to dissident technology or to technoliberalism, either if any of these are produced in some way in other parts of the world that have been the production and effect of colonialism, precisely, whether they exist or whether there are artists, collective, engineers, thinking about this and engaging it. I don't know, but it just seemed like asking that question or having it there would be a way of addressing the universalism that is at the heart of humanity and technology as your project assumed.
I think we better answer.
Well, maybe I'll start with your question, and then we can work our way.
We can do it all.
Are we really? It seems impossible. So I want to just say that we do very explicitly talk in our book that this is a project about, it's primarily like a US focused project. And we articulate that very explicitly to counter a lot of work that talks about technology as if it is universal. So like while, so we situate this in a kind of post-World War II, and we do have several examples that are sort of not US based, like the Microphone Project. We have like an example of Spain, right, in one of our chapters. But for the most part, we do situate this as a US based project, and in part because of sort of the dominance of US imperial form. And therefore the racial, but not articulated as racial logics that structure US dominance are built into these technologies. So that is what we track.
Maybe I'll just keep going backwards to the questions to Palom's question. So the form, it's interesting because we started with the form of the technologies. We started by thinking, okay, we're going to look at post-World War II US technological development in these very specific ways, and we'll look at technologies that are self-consciously meant to reproduce or replace humans or human functions. And then we realized, no, that wasn't actually the lead we were on. In fact, the lead we were on was what it was about the liberal subject the liberal modern subject, what it was about political modernity that was shifting that subject's way of knowing that it was free from subjugation of other humans to relations of technology. So the relations, as you pointed out, aren't what's changing. The I, the me, the human is also not changing, but as various political and revolutionary politics have kind of changed a little bit of our social reality, we've noticed subjects not changing, but rather we go elsewhere to get that, we could call it it's almost a dialectic of freedom, right? How do you know you're free? Oh, because this isn't free, right? How do you know you're human? Because this isn't human. I mean, that's a very gross simplification of Saidiya Hartman's argument, but we saw it because we started engaging the post-humanist conversations. Why are these people going to theorize objects and matter? People who used to actually work on things like gender and sexuality, and we thought, the answer is because we're going to step in it here, but basically women of color and third-world feminists came into gender studies departments, and now the terrain on which we were thinking about what is difference had changed. And so it was easier to talk about objects. And so we thought, we're going to talk about objects, and we're also going to talk about race and gender while we do it, and realize that in fact this history, this historical relation to these technologies that are supposedly freeing us as humans to do other things actually was a very historically familiar relationship to positions of unfree humans. So it was less about the form. We realize it's not about the form. In fact, it's about the relation, if that makes sense.
And then the question of replaceability, definitely technologies are actually replacing certain kinds of work. But one of the things that we ask is what kind of work is imagined as dull, dirty, repetitive, boring, that then gets sort of that technology replaces, right? Because there's certain spheres of work, and throughout this kind of vast archive we've assembled of media, news sources, engineering projects, etc. Right? It becomes really clear that the kind of dull, dirty, repetitive, boring work that then the technologies are designed to replace, right, is a kind of has a long history as support service work that has historically been done by racialized gendered populations, right? So that's something that we track, and of course, I'll try to.
Are you? Go ahead.
No. I don't even remember where we are now. This is writing it in a messy way. If only I had a robot to write it down for me in an orderly manner.
I was going to go back to the question. What does it mean when our instruments of revolution are the instruments of surveillance and discipline at the same time? Which I don't know. When I was thinking about that, I thought, was there ever a time when we had a pure revolutionary object? Fun question. Maybe not the scope of our talk, but what I was thinking was, you know, it made me think also about this question you brought up, which is what is design without the designer? So when people talk about Twitter, Facebook, or even the norms of algorithmic management, or the way that data, that algorithms work, and you know, cleaning the data, preparing data is now a huge task for humankind. Like so many of us are actually producing and organizing data for artificial intelligence to run on, right? That's one of the things we're doing all the time. You're doing it right now if you're on your phone. So thinking about infrastructure of communication is interesting. Who designed it? It was actually, you know, there are different stories about how the infrastructure of communication was designed, but Anil Dash over in San Francisco, who's a kind of big advocate for ethics in application design, says, you know, there was no oversight. Everyone put Uber on their phone, and suddenly we had a new infrastructure for ride sharing, right? Again, collaborative ride sharing. No one thought about what it would do. It was on everyone's phones, and then, like, you know, so there was, you know, a small team of designers who changed everything all at once. But then other times I think, well, maybe there are ways that we can look at infrastructure as collaboratively designed. So I don't know how this reflects on the question of technology and revolution. But this idea of techno-futurism, and you had talked about dissident imaginaries, is it a refusal of the future? And I think that's a very interesting question that can we take a few moments to talk about. Refusal of future, but also this question of the new man, techno-futurism as not just something that happens now, that was in this earlier revolutionary imaginary. So I really like that question. New humanism, can we get out of this figure of the new human? Yeah. I mean, our whole book is such a nice 5 minutes. But I mean, in some ways, that's what our book is saying. It's saying this keeps happening over and over again. We keep thinking that we're going to revolutionize society, and then we just kind of move forward. The new human is actually the old human with like humor.
And then also the possibility of historicizing the very concept of society, at least the way Durkheim understood it. So the question here is, I mean, you know, socialism, clearly social society. I'm not suggesting we are going to resolve these issues in the next 5 minutes, but
if you want to add to that, you know, Darwin thought that we were the machine, and those emotions could actually be triggered. So in that sense, you know, he thought we are the machine that we're imagining constantly, and we're becoming maybe more desperate or different from it, and there are different things that we're going to do. So we can say it's the same thing, but when we measure it, as you point out, you know, when was revolution done without an object, it wasn't, you know, problematic, indeed. So we're just constantly changing that model to fix onto something as a concept. But thank you.
Can I just go back to the thing you said about Darwin, because that's in the book.
Yeah.
Just fun fact, Cynthia Brazil actually read Darwin's description of the drives behind human affect, and then literally like designed her social
Darwin stole it from the car.
So, yeah.
Is there any other question, or should we continue after lunch? For the conference participants, and I'm sorry we can't offer lunch to everyone, that's really terrible. There is going to be lunch in the room next door, and otherwise we will all reconvene. What? 1:45? 1:45.